I was wondering, okay, I was thinking maybe a kind of straight line way to start. And I've been thinking about this a lot recently, is like how it all began, how you first came to art. Because I don't think I know this part of your art story. And I've been thinking about my own a bit lately, what with the dismantling of my childhood. Uh, and just thinking about how prevalent or not art was when you were growing up and how you knew to move towards it.
Yeah. Well, I suppose for me, it's sort of, and everything comes back to this. It's through text and writing, really, I suppose, but also through sculpture. So it's quite weird. Probably the main thing that really influenced me early on was studying the caretaker at school. Sort of, well, we weren't actually, yeah, for A levels, and there's something about Pinter that I'm obsessed with and always have been, and that's been a real thread through everything that I do. And there's something about the mode of script writing that's proposed that seems, yeah. And of course, then he's influenced by Beckett, so there's like these echoes towards art. And Beckett's the kind of artist, isn't he, of the theatre folk?
They all
So
love Beckett. We all love Beckett.
everyone loves Beckett. Oh yeah, yeah. But there's something particular about Pinter, and I suppose I did study art at school, and I was really good at drawing, which is often an experience I think artists have. Yeah, so literature and drawing is really how I came to it. But I remember we went on a school trip, and I saw to Tate Britain, and I saw a show of minimalism. And I really loved it. I couldn't really explain why, but I just was really taken with it. Yeah. So it's a minimalism as well, strangely. It's been a big thing, like the sort of massiveness of those objects and the fact that lots of them are like really well made. I really enjoyed that too. So it's quite peculiar. But yeah,
Yeah.
those were the main things. Oh, and Barbara Hepworth, Kettle's Yard is quite near Bedford. So we went to Kettle's Yard. You know, I did my foundation course at Bedford College. Really loved that. That was fantastic. That was like the first time I felt like an artist and made big things and tried all sorts of material processes. So to start with, for me, definitely through sculpture
God, so
and that kind of thing. What about you?
there's a major consistency then throughout all of your practice, like from the very beginning. Like into
I don't see it that
minimalism,
way.
it's all still there.
I suppose it is. It just means I don't progress very fast, I guess.
Well,
I
no, it
don't
means
know.
like you started off already knowing. And I think what I've been thinking about is how completely opposite to that my experience is. Like when I was young, there was Agatha Christie books in the house, but that was it. I didn't know art even existed. And we did art at school, but I just thought that must be just something to keep me busy. I didn't know that there was sort of something correlative in the real world that people actually did. I didn't know that, well, I knew that like milk came from cows, not from the supermarket, but didn't know that television didn't come from the television set or that music didn't come from the radio. I didn't know that there were people behind this stuff. And I didn't even know that art existed. And it was just something that I did at A level so that I didn't have to do hockey on a Wednesday afternoon.
Sounds like a good enough reason.
Yeah. It was the only sort of concrete reason for doing anything at that age. And then as kind of rock and roll lifestyle kicked in and all the other subjects faded away, art was the one thing where you could do the rock and roll and the thing, the academic thing. And just art school was a way of not having to grow up and get a job. I still didn't think it was, I didn't know that the art world existed. And then
Yeah, I don't know what I thought of it. I don't know what I think. It's an odd construct, isn't it? Because, and often in teaching, people talk about feeling like, oh, they don't fit in the art world, but there is no such thing, as we know, of course. It's lots
no.
of art worlds all joined together like a sort of messy, I don't know, it's more like a pile of art worlds, actually, isn't it? So it's kind of like a sort of strange. So I think when I was probably at art school, I did believe that idea of like there being you know, an art world that I wanted to be part of. When I was doing my degree, it's like Damien Hirst was kind of up for the Turner Prize, and it was all that generation. And I went to Bath College. It's called Bath Spa University now, I think, and it used to be Corsham Institute in the old days. So it has a legacy of being a really lovely old art school from the 70s. And oddly enough, as a non sequitur, but Michael Penny, one of the tutors there, had also taught Nigel Rolfe, who I ended up working with at the Royal College of Art. So Michael Penny taught both of us, and which is really strange because Nigel is probably about, I would say, 25 to 30 years older than me. So it was really odd. There's a sense of continuity at Bath, and obviously in those sort of beautiful buildings. It was quite an old-fashioned, very pleasurable idea of what it was like to be at an art school, I suppose. And then the horrible ambitious side kicked in when I went to Chelsea, and that became, it felt very pressurized, and everyone was suddenly extraordinary and international and really good, and with sort of careers already. So it shifted away from something that I really treasured, and I've been trying to sort of get back to that idea of what it was that I found really pleasurable and I don't know, enjoyable about ideas and art when I was doing my BA, probably, because it shifted sometime after that. But it's but yeah, I didn't really have an idea of the art world at all. I had like the romantic myth of the artist, I suppose. So Barbara Hepworth would be that for me, this woman making these kind of enormous edifices, and yeah, it was a more romantic idea perhaps. And literature is kind of where I came in, because the way that you're taught literature at school, or at least a sort of not very good state school, it's probably the closest thing to art thinking, isn't it?
Yeah.
Because art had nothing to do with art, really, the way it's taught in secondary school still, probably. It's got nothing to do with anything that I do now except drawing, but you know.
Yeah, I think I eventually came to it totally by accident. So working throughout my 20s in a pub, it became it came about, well, yeah, I started writing about art as a critic, well, eventually becoming a critic after being a kind of jobbing writing about art for a website person, and gradually realizing that I had a facility for writing and thinking through art. And then it was only in my 30s, I think, that I started to think and make in the way that might be identified as an artist. So yeah, I think whereas you've had this great sense of continuity, I feel a bit more haphazard, having
But
fallen into it.
that's your thing. That's completely your thing. You've got the most sort of amazing sense of curiosity. You've got a super spicy brain. I know none to match it. So the way that you kind of jump about, no, but intellectually, that fluidity was something that really attracted me to you when I met you. I just thought, this is really amazing that you're kind of, you know. So I think that I don't know, and your experience of, I think the working in the pub thing, oddly, I think it's really suited you for everything that you do now, like the encounter.
I mean, rather than fluidity, I think of it as a responsivity of I think I'm more reactive than proactive. Terrible word. Is that even an opposite? But rather than knowing what I would want to do, I respond to what is possible with the materials that are presented. Whereas I think you have more of a kind of internal guiding desire line. Is that fair to say?
Well, it's interesting you talk about responsiveness, because I do feel like key shifts in my career, it always feels ridiculous calling it my career. Anyway, but yeah, key shifts that have happened have been because certain opportunities have come up at particular times, and they're always related, often to really sort of dire financial need, like, you know, really urgent. Oh my God, I better apply for some things because I really don't know how I'm going to carry on if I don't. And then getting a grant to make a really unusually shaped exhibition in a weird venue. So, and it's kind of oddly, I found that was something that I enjoyed. I enjoyed having some sense of parameter. I think when I'm just left to my own devices to imagine anything, it becomes a bit, I don't know, I know
Okay.
other people, a lot of other people seem to have like a real strong sense of what they do and make, and I sort of half do, but there's a part of me that's always open to suggestion, which I think is one thing that we have in common, which is probably why we have that sort of simpatico on that score.
And also, I think something else that we might have in common, and the reason why you're really good at applications and getting grants and opportunities, is that you're really good at promising people what they want or what they think they want. I
And then not delivering
think
it
we
at
might
all.
both be pleasers.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think it's like, to begin with, it did feel cynical. Well, not cynical, but I certainly thought, well, I found myself good. Because before I well, it was odd. So this is related to my trajectory, so I should probably put this in here. But I sort of finished my MA, and I actually felt pretty demoralised by the fact that, you know, like loads of my lovely fellow students were getting signed by galleries and selling work to the Tate, and I just certainly wasn't anywhere near that at that time. So I had some fantastic colleagues, but then so I thought, well, how can I sort of take control of this, and I thought that curating seemed like a thing to try, and through that, this kind of unfolding interdisciplinarity, I became like a sort of magpie, just really obsessed.
Mm.
Through my social life, I was meeting comedians and theatre makers and all sorts of people that I thought, oh, it became like a sort of butterfly net, sort of dragging people in, sometimes willingly, sometimes unwillingly, trying things out, making. So that was all kind of part of the thing as well. So I what was I saying? I can't remember. Lost the thread. We had a lovely chat, and then I sort of got sidetracked.
I quite liked where it was going, that interdisciplinarity idea.
Yeah.
Responsivity. It was
Oh
making
yeah. Yeah.
think about how I think also the other thing that we have so many things in common, so many things, but something else is that we both at some points really love working alone, and at other points really love working with other people, and sometimes get the horror from working alone and the horror from working with other people, and shuttle back and forth between those two apparent poles.
Yeah, definitely. There's a thing of like, I suppose. So I mean, we've both presented work in these kind of ultra sort of unusual contexts. Really, I suppose less so. Things have become much more sort of open, haven't they? Really, in terms of how things are, in terms of how things are programmed and how collaborators find each other. And you know, I think there is more kind of organizational openness to thinking about what it means to program meaningfully in an interdisciplinary way, and those structures didn't feel like they were there perhaps at the beginning when I sort of started doing that curating activity. And yeah, the thing of working with other people is things can move forward so fast, and if you if you kind of admire a particular aspect of someone's practice, maybe you sort of realize that there's part of it that chimes with your own, but part of it that you're missing. It's so exciting to
Mm.
kind of have some sort of fusion moment where things shift permanently in your practice from that experience, and then other times it just doesn't work. And so it's a constant role of kind of experimentation, and I sort of came up with structures to support that. I suppose I wanted to come up with curatorial structures that would support that kind of play, because I mean I think unfortunately economically we're still in quite a kind of similar position in art. It's difficult to support these kind of small kind of interdisciplinary experiments in any meaningful way. And often if you're making performance work, even now, I mean, yeah, galleries find it hard to support things that aren't material, possibly.
Mm.
I don't know, but that has shifted. Of course, there's like the turbine tanks and there's all this, but there's still kind of like big performance commissions, and then smaller things. There's institutions like Somerset House, where I have a studio, that do small itinerant things. There's a lot of festivals that there didn't kind of used to be, and I found myself being quite attracted to working in places where I wasn't really welcome. So like the Edinburgh Book Festival, I did an event, and the Edinburgh Festival generally, being amongst all that fringe stuff. And then I wasn't in the art festival, which is really funny. So it's like a sort of peculiar with this same project. It sort of went around various things, but it didn't. Oh yeah, it's just yeah. There's something about trying to insert something to expand the possibility of what it might be. So,
Mm.
and we're both interested in theatre from that point of view, I think, aren't we?
Yeah, I was thinking about a taxonomy of types of interdisciplinary collaboration, and how, in particular projects, they've sat within or beside what I do. So there was a radio sitcom set in the art world that I did as a kind of group collaboration at the ICA. God, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago now. And that was a process of melding different disciplines. They were theatre performers and improv comedians and artists and writers. And the difficulty there was finding a process that would support all of the voices. So, for example, the improvisers were really brilliant at getting their voice out into the room, and the artists less so. So, had to reconstruct the whole project to be able to make it inhabitable by all these different kinds of sensibilities and skills. And then there's something like the large scale or chamber operas that I've worked on, where there's a real delineation of who does what. There's no crossover at all, and you know exactly what the parameter of your role is, which I found kind of liberating in some ways, but also totally horrifying in others. I found I was silenced in the opera rehearsal room because I had almost nothing to bring to the performers other than, you know, libretto kind of details. The specialist language and the history was so other. And then when I make these odd little performances, like in a swimming pool, where I work with voice actors or actors, then I take on a real directorial role where I get to tell them what I want them to pursue. So how to direct their whatever they're bringing, whether it's, you know, body, voice, or making skills. That feels really different again to the melding or the delineation of tasks. And then there's what you're talking about, this more curatorial practice, where you're making something which is a container in which other artists put in their self-contained elements. So there's a different approach there, where you're making something on your own terms in such a way that it can hold these other people's practices or works without, that's really difficult, without encroaching on what they're trying to do, but whilst also giving it a coherent context. So that's my taxonomy of working with others that I've come up with so far.
See, mine would be quite different. So it began from that curatorial perspective, I suppose, and needing a break from making, because I was really quite rubbish on my MA, I've got to say. I look back now and I think, oh dear. And I knew it and didn't know it simultaneously. So like the curatorial aspect, I really enjoyed it, I would say, for a while, and I did some really quite big projects. And there was a point at which I probably could have gone on to be a sort of producer myself or a curator. Producer's probably more me than being a curator, I think. Sort of logistically, the shapes that I would make would be quite unwieldy, unusual at the time. So I did this radio, it was a 24-hour radio broadcast, and that's where I met you,
we met.
That's where we met. So I set a brief that it was called Radio, and I invited all sorts of people to participate in that. It was completely bonkers. I'm trying to think off the top of my head. So Miranda July was in it, rather excitingly.
Oh, whoa! I didn't remember that. That's great.
I know.
I remember
That's great, isn't it? And
the floor. Remember Mark Wallinger?
Yes,
laughing at Andrew Bailey.
Andrew Bailey, who's an amazing alternative comedian, I suppose. Comedian, a sort of physical slapstick mime artist. It's hard to find words for Andrew Bailey, but anyway, so he emerged from things like People Like Us, a sort of very influential theatre company from the 80s, and that whole alternative comedy scene, like the Comedy Store, was sort of that's kind of period. So he was involved. Who else? Oh, I had 3 David Bowie impersonators who'd all been on Stars in Their Eyes, and we did this enormous live. I mean, the audacity when you were young of the things that you put on. So in at Chelsea College, before it was, and this wasn't when I was at university there anymore, but before it was, so next to the Tate, they bought that military hospital, but they hadn't done anything with it yet. So in the lecture theatre, we had this kind of live radio recording with the 3 Bowie impersonators, and then Paul Rooney's band and De Kunst and the Ken Ardley Playboys all performed kind of new arrangements that meant that the Bowie singers could still sing the songs like they did. So that was quite strange. And when you listen to it, you kind of, they slip in and out of sounding exactly like Bowie, which I really enjoyed. So the live event, it was very clear. They were wearing their Stars and Their Eyes costumes, which were really good, of course, because they're TV costumes, so they're posh. But then when you listen to it, it was just odd. There were certain notes they'd be aiming for where they'd really hit that mimesis. So there was that. There were things. It had the curatorial thing was that you had to make a sound piece that corresponded to some sort of radio format, so a phone-in show, classic serial, weather report. There were all these different kind of things attached to it. And the point was to move away from sound art that was kind of like really abstract. I wanted to reintroduce text, words, you know, not sound, noise making, abstract noise making. So that was the point for that. And then a similar approach, I suppose. What did I move on to next? Oh yeah, and then from there I did this sort of project that was based on production of an epic comic book. So again, a combination of fantastic comic artists and visual artists who work in a kind of way that would fit in that, and writers sort of collaborated to make sort of generic comic strips, so romance, superhero, and some that go off around the edges. And then that was at all sorts of festivals at Edinburgh. And then I got a job from that. So it's quite odd. And then I realised that I wasn't really enjoying it very much, I think, after a while. I love doing those shows. But then I kind of realised I was getting more and more interested in the containers for things than the actual work that's populating them. And I think that's death for a curator or a producer, really. You've got to be really passionate about the work that you're enabling and facilitating. So I sort of had to come out as an artist again, having left it for quite a while. So yeah, I feel like I've only really been an artist. I had a show with Kerry Hand in Liverpool at the time, my first, and she offered to represent me, which was so bizarre because I hadn't made anything for years. And then I had a show there, and that's kind of where things took off again. And so like you're talking about your taxonomy of kind of like how you worked. From then on, I had quite a lot of experience by then. I was quite confident about working with different types of practitioners, and I came up with this big authorial structure called This Is Performance Art, and it was like a fake documentary. So that was a totally authored way of collaborating with people that I was excited by and interested in, and it always provided a context for our work, no matter how slight. So we'd have like photo shoots where we'd kind of stage documentation, and then from that documentation we'd kind of derive performances, and then it was all contained within this multi-part documentary sort of thing. But it was also quite silly in places, and it drew in influences from sort of theatre, cabaret, comedy, art. But the important thing was it kind of restated the conditions for the sort of performance art that I wanted to see. So yeah, that's similar to some of your positions in there, isn't it? Like this authored, controlled shape. I've never done, your opera stuff is amazing though. I've never worked in a kind of formal situation where I'm not acknowledged as being an artist in the room.
Oh,
so
it's a great relief.
really
I tell you, it's a great relief. It's like being a tradesperson. I feel like a plasterer or something.
that's
and
great.
I quite like that position for art. I like the idea of art being something that's required in the world by the square inch, and to be able to provide it. When you, I think we should say a bit about how we met. Talking about radio,
yeah, we should.
Yeah, because I forget. You know, I was writing as a critic then, and I reviewed Radio for Art Monthly, and met up with you beforehand to find out about the background of the project, and I think what attracted us to one another was that we were both really into narrative and text and silliness, hilarity, which all sounds fair enough now. There's tons of people working narratively, but then 15 years ago, narrative was still a bit taboo. There was a bit of a hangover from modernism, I think, that no one was, well, there was a bit of confessional video making around, but there weren't people telling stories or there wasn't anywhere near as much text in work as there is now. And I think that we were just like we were delighted in one another for really favouring that aspect, that potential of work. But what I can't remember is how we started working together. So I
I
met you
can.
as a reviewer. Did you
I
get
rang
in
you.
touch with me? You rang me.
I rang you nervously and thought, oh,
Ah,
I like the look of this one. I'll give her a call. I really remember making the call from that really manky flat on the high street in Stonington. I rang you on the landline, and
that's so
yeah,
cool.
you. Yes, we met up and had a few uproarious. Well, a couple of months of just being uproarious. We had a lot of fun. We went to Frankfurt together quite early on as well. Do you
Oh,
remember?
yeah, our trip to the zoo was
So,
mind-opening.
yeah, you were reviewing something, weren't you? I can't remember what though,
And
because
then
we went there.
and we went on a sort of we turned it into a research trip as well, also in
That's
Brussels,
right.
didn't we? We met some people we were interested in working with and looking at loads of performance in expanded forms to see what we were allowed to do, I think.
Yeah, yeah. I'm having some strong visual images of that trip. Which are perhaps the best left covered. But it's like there was a. I think what we both share is a sense of curiosity and delight. I just think that kind of comes in a lot, and at that time more so than now, definitely. It certainly felt like that was a little bit thin on the ground in art quite often. I still sometimes think that entertainment is quite taboo. So like there was a big moment in performance art where that changed in the 80s. So you had
Mm,
kind of like a move away from this kind of very sort of abstract, image oriented body, endurance type practice, all of which is super important in my thinking. So I don't disregard it entirely, but I sort of remember, I don't know. One of the reasons I was sort of urged again to work with performance is that it was so unpopular. Sort of like it felt like yeah, it was that type of art. When you said performance, that's what people thought of. And of course, it's a completely exploded canon again
mm.
now. So in the 80s, you suddenly had a moment of people like Eric Bogosian and Anne Magnuson and, oh, what's his name? I'm trying to think of. But anyway, this kind of like monologue, sort of big theatrical thing. And in England, people like Gary Stevens and Rose English. And it sort of, for me, a lot of them were American that I really sort of found at a particular point. I thought, oh yeah, I can understand. And oh, another thing for me was that I participated in this live art development project called Performance Matters, and I met lots of, and that was curated by Gavin Butt, and he was sort of super important as well in my kind of development. But he was really interested in performance in a queer club context.
Mm.
So I suddenly met a load of people that seemed a lot more my shape than some of the other things that I'd done before. I thought, okay, and I think that was a moment when that kind of culture began to be a lot more visible,
Mm.
in programming. But going back to where we were then, yeah, I mean, so we decided we wanted to set up some kind of context, this idea of a supportive context for the kind of interdisciplinary work that we wanted to see, that was hard to place or program or finance or or any
Yeah,
of
we
that.
were also interested in I guess what now we would call queering history, and
Yes,
completely inventing an institution. I remember when we came up with the name Brown Mountain College of the Performing Arts, and
yes.
sitting down on the curb because we were laughing too much. Um, uh, but oh, I had a thought then about entertainment. Entertainment. I mean, I'm only now, just now, really coming out on the side of entertainment, infotainment. I mean, making a panto at the moment. Uh, but for me, performance, my performance tendencies came about because of lecturing and feeling academically lacking and trying to make up for a real thin content by pushing modes of delivery to really absurd extents. I think the first time I ever gave a lecture was at Goldsmiths. It was a series of 3 lectures, and the person that had done the series before me was Jacques Rancière, which is so incredibly intimidating. And I decided that I wanted to talk about the event, just thinking that that was like strictly an art idea, a sort of form of art making, and then realizing it was the hot theoretical potato of the time, and that I didn't really have time to research it properly. Also, I just split up with someone and was sleeping on a friend's sofa, and was in this really strange in between mental space. So in my state of sheer panic, I devised all these puppet shows, and I interviewed myself via video, and I did a dance to explain the theory of relativity, and it was just an absolute desperate attempt to at least be entertaining if I couldn't be educative. But I think that now I'm totally at peace with that, and I think now that if a piece, whatever it is, whether it's a lecture or a performance or a piece of writing, if it has one decent idea in it, then that's great. But if it is entertaining, then maybe that's even better.
There's a really brilliant bit that the comedian Simon Munnery does with a Venn diagram, and people often say that he's like the artist's comedian, so he's very much seen that way. And he draws the Venn diagram and he said, okay, so here's his kind of comedy and here's art, and I'm somewhere kind of in this crossover. He said, but that's right away from the centre of what's perceived to be good art and good comedy. So it's the interleaving layers of being quite crap and outsidery. Is that a good place to be? It's like that's always sort of stuck in my head as an image. It's
yes, two overlapping suburbs.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think the thing of entertainment, I've always been drawn to it as a thing that if you can load something up with loads of like really sort of sparkling conceptual content, but it can also be funny, and I've always, that's really appealed to me. All my favourite things probably have some humour in it, even if it's quite dark or to the side, or it's. I always was sort of drawn to that idea, I think. So I was never scared of doing things that were stupid. I must admit, I didn't have to get over much to do that.
The other useful thing about entertainment is it tends to come in prescribed forms. So it's really easy to make mutations of that apparent. So whereas in this kind of genreless thing that is contemporary art, it's really difficult to mutate something that doesn't have set forms. Whereas with entertainment forms, just a little, you're already, it's already incredibly apparent what manipulations you're up to. And I find that really, really useful.
It is, but then there's also that thing of in art, if you make something that has a really kind of coherent structure and is consumed in the same way as entertainment, even though the content of the food is different, if you like, it can end up just feeling like really crap radio drama. For example, I'm doing a show at the moment that's kind of based on lots of scripted monologues.
Do you think we both struggle with pastiche?
Yeah, I can't help it. I drift into it really easily, and I developed this a fake critic called Sir Francis Spalding for the This Is Performance Art things. He was like a Melvin Bragg kind of Kenneth Tynan kind of character, sort of stating authoritatively, well, this is the history of it, and that was kind of the point, to put things in there that weren't there. But the tone of that voice, I realized, yes, it was ludicrous and over the top, but it's really my favorite way of writing. That is my genuine authorial voice. I think pompous, overblown. I have a strong draw to that kind of, I suppose it's the absurdity of that language, the way that people congratulate themselves while they're explaining things, and I feel so insecure and constantly sort of stepping around sets of ideas that I feel I have no right interfering with, that I'm drawn to that confidence, and I like to ape it even when it's very clearly stupid. But it does drift into pastiche. Well, it just is pastiche before it even starts. I don't know.
No, but there is something subtle. There's something subtle in the choices that you make within the particularities of language that nudge it on from pastiche. And that's something that I've also learned recently from, I live with a composer who also dallies with pastiche, but has a kind of better understanding of how to avoid it. So how to extract from a pre-existing form something like an abstracted structure that you can take and build something new through, so that it doesn't have that kind of surface of pastiche, but there's something else about the original form that you've taken. And I think you've worked this way as well with writing, where you've taken structures of pre-existing plays and then written through those. So there's no danger of it being pastiche in that level, but it is still referencing these pre-existing forms.
Well, it can be quite a good writing exercise, can't it? So, like, I quite early on, I mean, I'm really obsessed with Alan Bennett's Talking Heads. Again, they've been a thing that I've just always been. I'm reading them again now while I'm writing. I'm writing a monologue as my father at the moment, which is really difficult because that slides about all over the place. But the thing about the Talking Heads monologues is they always reveal, of course, a lot more about themselves than they intend, and all the things they're telling you are kind of immaterial. It's the way they're telling you that gives you the truth of what's behind the speech, and that was very appealing. So I did one as Lee Krasner, Jackson Pollock's wife, and she's sort of revealing herself to be a downtrodden kind of like to a ludicrous degree, that he's like this machismo drunken lunatic raging about the place, and she's fitting in, making her work when she can, small, and putting it under the sofa and all that sort of stuff. But it actually reveals quite a harsh truth of how she was treated, sort of like, within history. So yeah, the sort of emphasis on him and his male genius, and somehow she's this supporting figure who's his carer, when actually, the work was really great. So it's a use of something that seems quite, because they're quite cozy to a lot of people when they think of Alan Bennett. They think of him as being quite cozy, and I must admit, I'm not so mad keen on the plays, but those Talking Heads, they're quite vicious. They're quite, there's an undertow of real darkness in there. Some really heavy themes like paedophilia and kind of murder and dementia and lack of social care and all that stuff. So it's yeah, and they appeal to me because they seem to communicate very directly and humorously. And they have a certain sort of Englishness to the language and the references, the specificity of the references that I kind of enjoy. Bennettisms. So yeah, that and then also I think. Yeah, the forms that I pick are always quite recognisable. I'm drawn to sitcoms as well. So I'm finding it quite hard writing as my dad. George Costanza's father in Seinfeld, they're sort of drifting quite close to being that, which does have an echo of my dad, but the way that I found myself transcribing episodes to see how the speech patterns work. So so writing for speech is different again, isn't it? It's a kind of different that I still don't feel like I've got on top of how to do that really, but that's what I do. I transcribe things I like, and they're usually entertainment things, and then yeah, sorry, I think I've drifted from what we were talking about.
No,
but
we
yeah.
were talking about forms. The release of information, I think, is really
Yeah.
I think Alan Bennett is really brilliant at that in Talking Heads. The release of information, the order in which ideas are strung together, that's the fundament. That's the fundamental practice of writing, isn't it? The leading of the reader through thoughts to an aesthetic and conceptual effect, and that sort of diagramming. I use diagramming quite a lot, where I would take maybe not something as long as a novel. It's very difficult to hold that all in your head at the same time, but film, for example, I tend to think of it in terms of a 4-dimensional geometry that unfolds. I think of it in terms of what decisions the maker has made that lead to a changing understanding of the perspectives that are being sculpted through, if that makes any sense at all.
No, it does. So it's
Kind of a
like there's
haptic understanding.
I get that. So it's like, Yeah, so I've just sort of finished a piece around Kafka's Metamorphosis. So I was really looking, well, in it, that I'm using it as a kind of, well, I've done this whole sort of research, which is another thing. Again, I kind of found myself with with the rise of social injustice, I found myself drawn to making socially engaged work in some way, and it seemed kind of unavoidable. And that's partly, again, it felt like at the beginning, well, I do believe in this, but it is partly a funding issue, like thinking about how the opportunities that came up would often have this kind of socially engaged aspect to them. But anyway, so I ended up working, I was going for about a year and a half to the to Bethlehem Hospital, and working in the National Psychosis Unit with neuroscientists and researchers from King's College, and it was really extraordinary. And in Kafka, the way that they treat the sudden realization that their son is a cockroach, it kind of became really, I mean, I think it's probably been observed before, but it felt very much like someone brewing mental illness or psychosis or schizophrenia or a similar disorder. So the family begin by being really shocked and empathetic and wanting to help, but he doesn't get better. Then it drifts to finding it inconvenient, and slowly resentment sets in, and then finally, total neglect. So it's a really sort of dark story structure. So I've kind of written a piece around that. So similarly, like you, using that sort of basic through line as a subject matter, then I've kind of, the context for the piece is that it's a voiceover actor trying to record an audiobook of Kafka's Metamorphosis, and as the tape keeps rewinding and going forward, it becomes hard to understand what's being spoken in real time and what's being recorded earlier, and everything starts to change and morph and shift and kind of dissolve. And it's kind of it's staged as a kind of vocal isolation booth in the gallery, so you listen to it through headphones and then you take up the position of the voiceover actor in the piece. It's like I'm really fond of dissolves. I really like setting up a situation and then that's a theme throughout lots of stuff that I've written. But yeah, that kind of idea, I do like a template. I think I'm a good mimic. I think that's in a lot of the stuff that I write. I really enjoy language registers, that you can recognize them and you suddenly are located in a particular place. So yeah.
What do you mean by language registers?
Well, if someone's being really officious,
Right.
there's a certain use of language that lets you know that they are trying to keep authority over the conversation. Or, yeah, I've worked with a lot of kind of, let's say, enthusiasts of varying kinds for lots of projects. They use loads of jargon because they want to kind of demonstrate to the rest of their tribe that, we share this thing, let's compare our, and it doesn't matter whether it's woodwork or, I don't know, home brewing or whatever, there's a sort of jargon attached to it. That's played out across all tribes, even intellectual tribes. So it's kind of like, I don't know, I suppose those language registers that situate you in a particular, I mean, it's to do with class as well. I'm interested in expression of class through speech. Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I think it's similarly patchwork things together out of I think of them as kind of speech genres in a way, types of speech that perform particular functions, and you can really analyze the text to see how it goes about doing what it does. So like the use of Latinate as opposed to Anglo-Saxon words, which is like Tony Blair when he was being a diplomat would use loads of Latinate words, but when he was being a man of the people would revert to Anglo-Saxon. Kind of noticing those technicalities of language as ways of deploying it to bring about desired effects. And so when I'm writing a libretto for an opera, I will be putting these characters through all kinds of adventures and torments, but giving them different kinds of language to as kind of tools for dealing with different moments in the plots and different kinds of relationships between characters. Thinking about the first opera, The Virtues of Things, there's all sorts of genres in there. Like there are mnemonics. There's a doctor who is trying to treat this family for it's a variance on Stendhal syndrome. they're prop makers, and they're having a response to the objects that they're making. So rather than swooning in front of objects of great beauty like artworks, they're having breakdowns when confronted with objects of great significance. So the props that they're making for other operas are bringing about their illness, and the doctor has to identify which parts of the brain might be being affected by this. So I met up with a real brain surgeon and asked her if, like you see online, medical students trotting out these mnemonics to remember what different parts of the brain do, whether actually practicing doctors do that as well, practicing surgeons. And she said that they did, but she also brought along a printout from Wikipedia about a particular part of the brain that I'd asked about. These people don't carry around all information in their brains at all times. They have these little linguistic tools and Wikipedia to help them. So the mnemonic is a big number for the doctor in the piece, and then there are the language types of opera itself. So people have big, grand, beautiful rhyming arias for when it's a really important emotional moment in the opera. There's tends not to be many great emotional moments in operas when I'm writing them, but when they are, they're very much signposted. Hopefully not to the extent of pastiche, but using that genre of opera writing, and so the whole opera is sort of patched together in a way, drawing on all these kinds of language that are operating and performing functions within art, but also within everyday practical life. Like ordering a pizza, you use certain types of vocabulary.
Yeah, I think I so often wondered about this. It must have been an extraordinary experience. I mean, the one thing we're also guilty of is being massivists. We we get overexcited and make everything too big with too many moving parts, and it all becomes really unwieldy. So it must have been. I was thinking about the pleasure of having that time to really develop that content in the way that you've just kind of outlined. Because normally for me, like all the production stuff is so complicated and difficult that sometimes the writing process doesn't get as much time as it needs, although it's had plenty at the moment with the global pandemic, but it doesn't seem to have helped much. But there's a sense that, yeah, within that situation where your role is the librettist, the writer, that you're freed up from all this other stuff, but then you get this enormous pleasure from seeing it all come together. You get the extraordinary singers and the musicians, and it's what artists dream of, really, the glamour of having all that stuff in a room. Or I do anyway. But
you also have no idea what it is until it's become something. So I have this kind of virtual version of it in the brain, but it's nothing like what eventually comes out. Probably, thank goodness. There are so many other elements to it. And luckily I work with a composer who I happen to live with, and we have a lot of time to have a conversation about the dramaturgy. If I were working remotely with a composer I didn't know so well and only had limited conversation time with, I have no idea what that would do to the process, because at the moment we both understand what we're trying to do through this narrative. We understand the ideas that we're trying to pursue, and we understand that we're not after that emotive hit of opera. We're using the form to explore other possibilities. But with another composer, I've only ever worked with the same one, so I have no idea what that would be like. And it's always quite a shock when you enter the space after spending quite a bit of time in rehearsal, where everything is still a bit virtual visually because the performers are concentrating on voice and movement. And so there's a few props around and maybe a sketched out layout of the stage, but you still have no idea what the opera looks like. And you only find that out about 6 days, 7 days before the opening night, and you've been working on it for like a year and a half or 2 years, and then you go, oh my god, it's this is what we've made. I had no idea. It's really, really shocking. And also that moment, that first moment when you hear the words that you've written down being sung, I find so embarrassing. Oh,
Yeah, I
I
think
meant to come
delighted.
and sing this.
Well, having seen it, it was extraordinary, and there was so many. What I liked most is I could so spot the Sallyisms all over it. I was because there were the subtitles going across, and I just thought, I recognised that voice.
Yeah, but
So that
you
was such a
really do. You really feel responsible. I mean, we feel a certain responsibility putting things out into the world, but putting things through other people's bodies and mouths is another scale of responsibility, I find.
It's funny. Responsibility is a thing. It's a thing that kind of comes up a lot for me, and through working collaboratively, that was something that really over the years has been really hard to negotiate, shape. My attitude changes to it often. So like thinking about the show that I'm working on at the moment, it's for Tetley in Leeds, but it's probably the biggest show I've had. So it's quite daunting, and a huge aspect of it has been working with lots of community groups. So the Bethlehem Hospital Research and the King's College, it was the Department of Psychosis Studies that I was kind of primarily working with. So just being given really extraordinary privileged access to just people's most vulnerable states, and people have been so generous in sharing, the experience of being inside psychosis, the carers who look after them, the nurses, the doctors, the increments of care that they've all experienced and at points haven't experienced are really amazing. And my idea initially had been that I would write a whole series of monologues based somehow on this. It was as loose as that, really, but quite quickly I realized that the responsibility of representing those voices, this is another kind of responsibility again. And how do you I became really stymied in trying to fictionalize it or fabulate around it in any way, because it felt like a betrayal of the people that were involved in it. So I sort of developed as a thing next to what I felt like I really wanted to do, which was building an enormous object collectively with lots of groups of men's sheds. So men's sheds are this organisation. There's like 500 chapters around the country, which is brilliant. And they're basically, they build themselves as a sort of mental health charity. So men of post-retirement age come to make and build and do. So I got lots of, I think 15 different chapters of, I call them chapters, it's like the Hells Angels, different chapters of men's sheds to build kind of speaker housings, and then work with a mental health choir to kind of develop this kind of multi-part choral piece with composer Gwyneth Herbert. And that was kind of also based on lots of kind of actual workshops with people doing, even just having the workshop and nothing else ever coming of it. We did them in prisons, we did them in all sorts of contexts. It was really an extraordinary research process, and condensing that down then into an artwork, it feels really difficult. I think that's why I've been having trouble with the show. So there's something about an idea of what's come out it's such an unusual object and set of work. It isn't anything that I would have imagined making. So I think I've become, like you were saying, you've become resigned to the idea, well, not resigned, just okay with the idea of being entertaining. I kind of at some point had to think, right, well, it's guiding me, and if I don't listen to it, then that's a really dangerous thing to do, especially when it has this kind of, involvement of vulnerable people and all the ethics kind of around that. But kind of what's resulted, we weren't forced to make outcome. We kind of consulted and kind of, I saw it as an extended period of consultation, that embedded deep research is really under the stuff then that grows out of the top of it. And then literally having those voices represented as a choir in the room with sculptural objects that were made by men having difficult times, often widowed, mental health problems, retired. It has a sort of quite weird, punchy energy to it. You do feel like those people are kind of congregated in a room together. So I was surprised. I didn't expect to make something so direct and quite emotional. So when you were talking about the opera, I was just kind of aware that it's just an extraordinarily rich intellectual soup of ideas, and I feel that slightly a part of what I've done has drifted away from that a bit. It's not that saying that contriving the methodology that's really ethically rigorous and supported by mental health professionals and all that stuff it's not a form of intellectualism, but those arch ideas I had to really question every time I put one in because I thought, well, it's starting to interfere with the emotive power of the things that have kind of been assembled. So that's been difficult, because I am quite arch by nature, and I like I
Well,
like to have word. You know, it's
I
yeah. Go
wonder,
on. Sorry.
I wonder if that's also because maybe both of us have come to recognize that art that isn't autonomous in a way that we might have once thought it was, that it is interleaved in and with and through the world, critically, and not just involved in itself. I'm thinking back to some of the really early things that we did out in the world, and we've done lots of stuff beyond the gallery.
Mm.
Remember we did that three-sided football match in Mablethorpe in Lincolnshire,
Yeah.
which was really difficult in how it interfaced with the real world. Sorry, these are all provisional terms. I'm still not sure how to refer to art and not art, because it really is
Yeah.
all interleaved. But like borrowing 3 sets of goalposts and one of them already being broken and then being blamed for breaking them, all of these sort of really uneasy, uncomfortable encounters with the not art part of the world. And then that time at the Bethnal Green Working Men's Club, where there was one of the performance pieces that was badly thought through on our part, I think, as producers, and an ambulance was called, not because anyone really was hurt, but because there was a misunderstanding amongst the audience of what was going on. And anyway, yeah, sort of a few unfortunate in moments of interleaving of art and not art contexts. And I think gradually over the years, those kind of experiences, but also a sort of intellectual analysis of what's really going on, has led me to realize that there is no such thing as the autonomy of art,
Yeah.
and that whatever is being dealt with, whatever is being addressed through the artwork, uh kind of it I don't it can't be just absorbed as material. And that's where this increased sense of responsibility comes from. That I was writing a piece recently about beeps, and was researching how these electronic sounds come to be in, say, reversing vehicles, and in intensive care units. Who designs them, and how musically are they considered, and thinking about their effect, like within traffic, or within the intensive care unit and the nursing staff. And maybe sort of previously I would have written about it in an essayistic way and approached it conceptually dry, with a conceptual dryness. But in this recent piece, it became a piece of autofiction about my mum being in intensive care. Um, but also the material that I'd gleaned from the people that I interviewed, it seemed really important to keep that intact and not fold it into uh,
Mm.
an idea of like
Mm.
a kind of conceptually molded piece that was making a singular point. Again, it became a kind of collage of perspectives. And I think that's quite a new thing for me anyway, to not drag the world into the practice, but to more than meet it halfway, and enact a kind of respect by keeping it more intact.
No, that makes sense. That makes sense to me, because this time I did feel like I was making well, it's they built these sort of sculptures that were speakers, and it was like a sort of precious hoard. When I thought of all the kind of interactions and conversations, I visited every single one of these chapters. So I had a really bonkers summer, just like traveling around the country, going to lots of light industrial units around the country, and discussing the design and the plan of it all. But when they were all together, I thought, well, it's my responsibility to stage it, because some of them are really wonky and strange, and they're all completely idiosyncratic, and they're all made in really different ways. But it was about sort of supplying this this context that they can read as precious objects that have been kind of made out of this collectivism. So the sculpture, the work, the installation needed to kind of reflect that. I think that's kind of how it felt. So like you're saying, it's having articulated this big complicated collaboration, it then becomes about stepping back and letting the things take center stage, I suppose, and making them legible, making them I suppose sort of beautiful in a way, because they're so unusual. It's just it's like a real, but if you just sort of encountered them in a gallery, I don't know what you'd think, you know, if they were just on the floor, you might, I don't know. So it was about, yeah, building a context where it's like a sort of precious music box. It's like this sort of collection of objects that have been drawn together. I don't know. So I think, yeah, that's it. That was a real shift for me. It just feels like a very direct artwork. But then the stuff around it, all the monologues and all the other things, are kind of more familiar territory, perhaps. But it's and similarly, I found myself, I've ended up in introducing autobiographical things into the show, which surprised me.
Yeah, I think we're both surprised by both of us. Are we being swayed by fashion there? Autofiction is very prevalent, but I think it's prevalent for a reason, because there's a grounded perspective that enables you to avoid generalizing.
And the hot sort of contested idea of voice and who can speak for whom and all that, it kind of makes sense that turning inwards would kind of would follow on from that. But it's a bit shocking. It's something I've always kind of massively avoided. So it's I'm not quite sure how I ended up doing it. I think it was about honesty as well. It was about honesty and authenticity. So all these people had shared all their stories with me around mental health and schizophrenia, and I felt that I had to share my lived experience of it as well. It felt like it was the thing that was missing. Like I had a show at Chapter, which is open and closed 4 times now, but I think it is finally closed. It's a shame.
Oh my God.
But it felt like the thing that was missing. The kind of, why have I got skin in the game, you know, for want of a better phrase. But it's yeah, that's kind of quite pleasant, isn't it? That's not a good place. But yeah.
What's important? I mean, what I think is a good thing to do, if we are going to be introducing the autobiographical, the autofictional, however we might want to ally ourselves, that the infrastructural is still present, that it's not a total inward-facing gesture, that you are still writing about mental health provision. I'm still writing about the design of beeps in reversing trucks. You know, we are firmly entwined in the structures that interlace us all in the fabric of whatever this spinning globe is.